Hi, my name is David, and I'm 68 years old. For 20 long years, my own son refused to even look me in the eye, all because his wife told him I was not worthy of being in their lives. Birthdays passed, holidays slipped by, and I sat in silence, waiting for even a single phone call that never came. But life has a way of changing tables. When fortune finally knocked on my door, everything shifted, especially the son who had abandoned me. Before I tell you how my sudden wealth turned 2 decades of rejection into the most unexpected Christmas of my life, I want to ask you, if your own child ignored you for 20 years, only to return when you became rich, what would you do? Let me know in the comments. And also tell me which city and country you're watching from, so I can thank you personally. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true stories like this. I wasn't a perfect man, but I tried to be a good father. My son Michael was my pride and joy. I still remember the nights when I used to come home late from work, covered in dust and sweat, only to find him waiting at the window. He would run to the door and leap into my arms shouting, "Dad's home!" Those were the years when love felt simple, when my small paycheck stretched just enough to keep food on the table, and when happiness meant nothing more than having my little boy sit beside me while we ate dinner. Michael grew up, got into college, and eventually met the woman who would change the course of our lives forever. Her name was Samantha, and from the very beginning, I felt an invisible wall rise between us. She was polite, yes, but in her eyes, I was never good enough. I was just a man who worked with his hands, who fixed engines and repaired broken doors, while she came from a family of polished shoes, expensive wines, and business dinners. I tried to impress her, tried to show her that love mattered more than status, but little by little, she whispered poison into my son's ears, and over time, that poison became truth to him. The first real sign came during Michael's wedding. I was so proud that day, wearing my old suit, holding a speech I had spent nights preparing. But when the moment came to give my toast, Samantha's father stood first. He spoke for 15 minutes, praising his daughter's beauty, his family's achievements, and even hinting at the bright future their money would guarantee. When I finally stood up, glass trembling in my hand, I barely got through 2 sentences before Samantha gently touched Michael's arm, whispered something, and suddenly my son interrupted. "Thanks, Dad, but maybe we should keep it short. We've got a lot of guests to get through." Laughter filled the hall, but it wasn't the warm kind. I sat down, my speech still folded in my hand, my heart already sinking. That was the night I realized I was being pushed aside. At first I made excuses. Young couples are busy, I told myself. They'll call when they can. But weeks turned into months, and months into years. I sent birthday cards. No reply. I left. Voicemails never returned. Once I even drove 3 hours to their house, only to find the lights off and the blinds drawn. I stood on that porch, gift in hand, while the neighbors across the street watered their lawns and pretended not to notice. Then came the harshest cut. When my first grandchild was born, I wasn't even told. I learned about it months later, through a distant cousin who saw a photo on social media. Do you know what it feels like to hold your breath for 20 years? To watch the seasons change, to grow older, weaker, lonelier, and still cling to the hope that one day, maybe one day, the phone would ring. It's like drowning slowly in silence. I tried everything. Once, I mailed Michael an old photo of him and me fishing at the lake, thinking it might spark a memory. The envelope came back with the words, "Return to sender," scrawled across it. Another time, I left a voicemail during Christmas, my voice trembling as I said, "I miss you, son. I'd love nothing more than to hear your voice." I never got a reply. Neighbors pitied me. Relatives avoided me, because even they had been told a version of the story where I was the villain, too controlling, too simple, too unworthy. And so, 20 years passed. 20 years of birthdays spent alone, of holidays where the only sound was the ticking of a clock, of Christmas mornings where the only gift under the tree was silence. But here's the thing about life. Just when you think the story is over, a new chapter begins. One day, while repairing an old shed on my property, I stumbled across papers I had nearly forgotten about. They were tied to land my father had left me, land I had always assumed was worthless. But as the city grew, developers started sniffing around, and suddenly that forgotten land became a gold mine. Overnight, the man who had been ignored, dismissed, and left in silence for 2 decades became something else. A wealthy man. And wealth, I would soon learn, has a way of opening doors, even the ones bolted shut for 20 years. When the papers slipped out of that dusty old box, I almost laughed. For years I had shoved them aside, thinking they belonged to a past that no longer mattered. They were documents tied to a piece of land my father had left me. Back then, it was just a patch of rocky soil on the outskirts of town, too far from anything, too barren to farm, too small to sell. But the city had been growing, stretching its fingers wider every year, and now what was once useless dirt had become prime property for developers hungry for space. At first, I didn't believe it. A letter came from a real estate company, then another and another, each offering more money than the last. I drove out there one morning, half expecting to find nothing but weeds and broken fences. Instead, I saw surveyors marking plots, trucks rumbling in the distance, and signs advertising new housing projects. The world had changed while I wasn't looking, and suddenly the land I had ignored for decades was worth millions. I didn't rush. I spoke to lawyers, I checked the records, I sat through long meetings where numbers and contracts were thrown across tables like cards in a game. When it was all settled, I walked out with more money than I had ever dreamed of. For most of my life, I had lived from one paycheck to the next, counting coins at the grocery store, praying that the truck would last another winter. Now, all of a sudden, I was a rich man. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Small towns have a way of carrying whispers faster than the wind. Old neighbors stopped me in the street, shaking my hand, smiling wider than they ever had before. People who had barely nodded at me for years now wanted to sit down for coffee. But the biggest change came when a familiar number flashed across my phone screen. I hadn't seen that number in over 20 years. For a moment I just stared at it. My heart pounded in my chest as if it were trying to make up for all the times it had broken in silence. I picked it up slowly, my voice unsteady. As I said, "Hello," there was a pause, and then I heard his voice, deeper now, older, but still unmistakably my son. "Dad, it's Michael." I nearly dropped the phone, my throat tightened, my knees weakened, and I had to sit down. 20 years of waiting, and suddenly his voice was in my ear again. He cleared his throat, hesitated, then said, "Listen, I know it's been a long time, but we're having Christmas at our place this year. Samantha thought it might be nice if you joined us." The words sounded rehearsed, stiff, unnatural, like lines from a script he had been forced to memorize. I could almost picture Samantha standing behind him, nodding, making sure he said the right things. For a long moment I didn't answer. My mind raced back through all the birthdays I had spent alone, all the unanswered letters, all the years of silence. Now suddenly I was being invited back, and the timing was no coincidence. They knew, they had heard. My son hadn't picked up the phone out of love. He had picked it up because of the fortune that now sat in my bank account. Still, I swallowed hard and said, "Christmas, huh? That's unexpected." He chuckled nervously. "Yeah, well, things change, things change." I repeated the words in my head long after we hung up. Yes, they do. And sometimes they change in ways that reveal who people really are. That night, I sat by my small Christmas tree, the same one I had decorated alone for years, and stared at the lights. For the first time in decades, I wasn't sure if I felt Hope or dread, I'd wanted this call for so long, dreamed of hearing my son's voice again, of being welcomed back into his life. But now that it had finally happened, I couldn't shake the suspicion that it wasn't love pulling me back. It was money. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. I bought a new suit, one that actually fit. I picked out gifts carefully, not expensive or flashy, but meaningful, things I thought my grandchildren might cherish. I even wrapped an old photograph of Michael and me at the lake, thinking maybe, just maybe, he would remember the boy who used to wait for his father at the window. But beneath every ribbon I tied, beneath every piece of wrapping paper, there was doubt. Doubt that this reunion was real, doubt that my son truly wanted me there, doubt that Christmas would bring anything more than another painful reminder of how far we had drifted apart. On Christmas Eve, I loaded the gifts into my car and stared at the address Michael had texted me. It was a big house in a nice neighborhood, the kind of place Samantha had always dreamed of. As I drove through the snow-covered streets, I tried to steady my hands on the wheel, tried to calm the storm raging inside me. 20 years of silence were about to end, and I had no idea whether it would feel like coming home or walking into a trap. The snow crunched under my shoes as I walked up the stone pathway leading to their front door. The house was glowing with warm yellow light, every window dressed with wreaths and garlands. It looked like the picture of a perfect Christmas, the kind you only see on greeting cards. For a moment, I stood there staring at it, clutching the gift bags in my hands, trying to summon the courage to knock. My reflection in the glass door looked older, wearier, and far more vulnerable than I wanted to admit. When the door finally opened, Samantha's smile was the first thing I saw. It was wide, polished, and practiced, like the kind of smile you give to a business associate, not a father-in-law you had cut out for 2 decades. "David," she said brightly, as if the last 20 years had been nothing more than a short holiday. "Come in. It's freezing out there." Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were calculating. She took the bags from my hands before I could even step inside and passed them to one of the children without glancing at what was inside. Michael appeared behind her, hands tucked awkwardly in his pockets, his face flushed. "Hey, Dad," he said quietly. Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of all the silence between us. The smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey filled the air as I stepped into the living room. A towering Christmas tree stood by the window, covered in gold, ornaments and sparkling lights. Beneath it were piles of presents perfectly wrapped, like something out of a catalogue. Children's voices echoed from upstairs, and for a brief moment I thought of how many years I had missed. First steps, first words, birthdays, graduations, all lived without me. Dinner was served in a grand dining room with a polished oak. Table set for 12. Silver cutlery gleamed under the chandelier, and crystal glasses clinked as everyone found their seats. I was placed at the far end of the table, directly across from Samantha, while Michael sat beside her. The children eyed me curiously, whispering among themselves, clearly unsure who this old man was that had suddenly appeared in their holiday picture. Samantha led the conversation, her voice light and cheerful, filling the silence that Michael and I couldn't break. She asked about my health, my house, even complimented my suit. But every time she spoke, I caught the careful way she steered the talk toward money. "I heard the property values have gone up in your area," she said at one point, sipping her wine. "Must be nice, especially at this stage of life, to have such stability." I smiled politely, but inside the words cut. Stability, wealth, comfort. She wasn't talking about me. She was talking about what I now represented, a fortune waiting to be tapped. Michael avoided my eyes most of the evening. He laughed when others laughed, nodded when Samantha spoke, but he never truly looked at me. When I did catch his gaze, it flickered away as if the years of absence were too heavy for him to face. At one point, the youngest grandchild, a boy, with bright eyes and messy hair, ran up to me with a drawing in his hand. "Who are you?" he asked bluntly, his innocence cutting sharper than any adult's words. Samantha rushed over, shushing him, but I placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "I'm someone who used to love your dad very much," I said softly. The boy looked at me curiously before scampering back to the tree. As the night wore on, the tension became harder to ignore. Every laugh felt forced, every toast hollow. Samantha's parents, seated nearby, exchanged knowing looks whenever the subject of finances came up. Michael finally asked, hesitantly, "So, Dad, what have you been up to these days?" His voice cracked as if he already knew the answer but wanted to hear me say it out loud. I took a sip of water and placed my glass carefully back on the table. "I've been keeping busy," I replied. "An old piece of land turned out to be worth something. After all, surprising how time changes things, isn't it?" The room grew quiet for a moment. Samantha leaned forward, her smile widening just slightly, her eyes glinting with interest. "That's wonderful," she said smoothly. "Families should celebrate good fortune together, don't you think?" I nodded, but inside I felt the chill of the snow outside creeping into my bones. This wasn't about family, not really. I could feel it in the way every conversation circled back to money, in the way my son sat beside his wife like a shadow, in the way the room seemed to shift whenever the word wealth was mentioned. After dinner, as everyone gathered around the tree to open presents, I sat quietly in the corner. The children ripped open boxes of toys and clothes, squealing with joy, while Samantha handed out gifts with theatrical generosity. My modest packages sat unopened for a while, almost forgotten in the pile, until Michael finally noticed and handed them out. The children tore into them without ceremony, books, puzzles, and small keepsakes. Samantha smiled politely, murmuring thanks, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. These weren't the grand gestures she had expected from a man who had suddenly come into wealth. I watched the scene unfold, my heart heavy. This was the reunion I had dreamed of for 20 years, and yet it felt hollow, like an echo of something that used to be real. My son was here, yes, but not truly. His laughter wasn't the laughter of the boy who once ran to greet me at the door. It was the laughter of a man caught between loyalty to his wife and the ghost of a father he had buried long ago. As the night wound down, I stood near the window, watching the snow fall softly outside. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, older, wiser, and infinitely lonelier. Behind me, the family I once longed for was gathered around a fire, their voices blending into a chorus that didn't include me. I realized then that this Christmas wasn't about reconciliation. It was about curiosity, about appearances, about money, and as much as it hurt, the truth settled heavy in my chest. I had been invited back not out of love, but out of interest. When the laughter finally began to fade and the children were ushered off to bed, the adults lingered in the living room with their glasses of wine. Samantha sat poised on the couch, her smile still plastered on, but her eyes sharp and restless, like a hawk circling its prey. Michael sat beside her, shoulders slumped, silent, his gaze fixed on the fire. I hadn't said much all evening. I had listened, watched, and let the weight of silence do its work. But now, as the room grew quieter, I cleared my throat. The sound made Samantha glance up, her smile twitching slightly, as if she already expected something. "I brought something with me," I said, reaching into the worn leather bag I had carried inside earlier. For a moment their eyes lit up, the kind of light that only appears when people anticipate good fortune. Samantha leaned forward, Michael shifted uncomfortably, and even her parents straightened in their chairs. I pulled out a stack of envelopes, neatly sealed, each one carrying a name. I placed them gently on the coffee table, one by one, letting the sound of the paper echo in the stillness of the room. "These," I said quietly, "are the choices I've made about the future." Michael's Brow furrowed. Samantha's smile faltered. Future? She repeated, her voice carefully neutral. Yes, I said. 20 years is a long time, long enough for me to learn the value of time, of silence, of family, and of absence. I may have gained money, but money can't buy back birthdays. It can't buy back holidays. It can't buy back the sound of my son's voice when he was 10 years old, waiting at the window for me. That time is gone, and nothing I own can bring it back. The room was still, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Samantha crossed her legs and leaned forward, her smile returning, brittle and forced. David, of course, we all understand that, but surely family should be included in whatever plans you're making. Michael is your only son. The children, your grandchildren, they should be provided for. Her words were smooth, practiced, dripping with expectation. But I only nodded, sliding the envelopes closer to me. You're right. Family should be provided for. Which is why these papers don't belong to banks or strangers. They belong to the people I believe still carry the meaning of family. Michael finally looked up, confusion in his eyes. What are you saying, Dad? I met his gaze steadily, feeling the tremor in my hands, but keeping my voice calm. I've set aside trust funds, not for you, Michael, and not for Samantha, for the children, directly. Their education, their future, their lives. It bypasses both of you. It ensures they'll have what they need, without the strings of resentment or greed attached. The color drained from Samantha's face. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as though searching for the right words. Michael shifted, his lips parting, his hands tightening into fists on his knees. And as for the rest, I continued, sliding another envelope across the table. Much of it has already gone to causes I care about. Scholarships for kids who never had a chance. Housing for families who need a start. Charities that keep the lonely from spending Christmases like I spent mine. The silence that followed was heavy, crushing. Samantha's polished mask cracked just enough to reveal the anger simmering beneath. Michael stared at me, his jaw tight, his face pale. I didn't come here tonight to buy my way back into your lives, I said softly. I came because you invited me. For 20 years I waited for a call that never came. Tonight I heard your voices again. That's enough for me, but don't mistake my presence for an open vault. I'm still the same man I was when you turned me away, except now I know the worth of my silence. I stood slowly, sliding the remaining envelopes back into my bag. The room remained frozen, no one daring to speak. I could feel their eyes, burning into me, Samantha's sharp with fury, Michael's clouded with shame. Thank you for dinner, I said finally. The food was good, the tree was beautiful, and the children, they're wonderful. Take care of them, because in the end, they are the only part of this family worth saving. I turned toward the door, my coat draped over my arm, the snow waiting for me outside. Behind me, I heard Samantha's voice break the silence, sharper now, stripped of sweetness. So that's it? You come here, wave your fortune around and walk out? After everything, after 20 years, you leave like this? I paused at the doorway, my hand on the knob, and looked back just once. My eyes found Michael's, tired and lost. No, I said quietly. After 20 years, I finally walk away on my own terms, and with that, I stepped out into the cold, leaving the warmth of their perfect Christmas behind me. The night air bit at my face as I stepped outside, the crunch of snow under my shoes the only sound that followed me. Behind me, their house still glowed with light and warmth, laughter muffled through the walls. But I knew it wasn't meant for me. Not really. It hadn't been for a long time. I pulled my coat tighter around me, each breath forming a cloud in the frosty air, and walked slowly to my car. I sat there for a long moment, hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at the falling snow, My chest was heavy, but strangely there was no bitterness. The ache of years lost was still there, sharp and deep, but for the first time in 2 decades I felt clarity. They had invited me, not because they wanted me back, but because they wanted what I had, and I had given them my answer, not in anger, not in revenge, but in truth. As I drove home, the streets quiet, lined with houses glowing with their own holiday lights, I thought about all the Christmases I had spent alone. I remembered the unopened letters, the voicemails left without reply, the birthdays that came and went in silence. I remembered the sting of being erased, of being nothing more than a shadow in my own son's life. Yet tonight, I realized something important. Those years had shaped me. They had taught me patience, resilience, and the value of mercy. When I finally reached my house, the small tree in the window still twinkled faintly, waiting for me. I set my bag down on the table, took off my coat, and sat in the quiet of my own living room. It was not grand, not lavish, but it was mine. I poured myself a cup of tea and let the warmth spread through me as the silence settled around me. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of loneliness, but a calm, peaceful quiet. The next morning, I woke early and went to the kitchen. I opened the fridge, where I had taped a piece of paper weeks ago with 3 simple words, earned, not owed. I touched the paper gently with my fingertips, letting the truth of those words sink in. For years, I had longed for recognition, for my son's voice, for my family's acceptance. But in the end, what mattered was not what I was owed, but what I had earned, my dignity, my peace, and my ability to choose how to use the life I had left. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from one of the charities I had supported, thanking me for my contribution. They enclosed a photograph of children smiling, holding new books in their hands, their eyes bright with hope. I sat at the table staring at that picture, and, for the first time in years, I felt whole. Those children didn't know me, but they carried a piece of me forward. My wealth had built something real, something lasting. I didn't hear from Michael after that night. Not a call, not a message. Samantha, I imagined, was furious, perhaps even embarrassed by the way the evening had ended. But strangely, the silence no longer hurt. It was just silence, empty of power, empty of pain. I had given them the chance to look me in the eye, and I had walked away without begging for their approval. Sometimes I wonder if my grandchildren will one day find out the truth. If they'll know that the trust funds set aside for them came directly from me, that their education and opportunities were built on a foundation of the love their father and mother had tried to erase. Maybe one day, when they're old enough to understand, they'll see past the bitterness and know that their grandfather cared in the only way he knew how. Until then, I live my life simply. I work in my garden. I visit the town library. I share coffee with the neighbors who stayed by my side. I've grown used to the rhythm of days filled with peace rather than longing. And though the pain of the past never fully disappears, it no longer controls me. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks burst in the distance, I stood at my window and whispered to myself, 20 years they kept me out. But tonight, I walked, out on my own terms. The words lingered in the air, soft and final, like the closing of a chapter. I don't know if my son will ever come back to me. Maybe he won't. Maybe Samantha's voice will always be louder than mine in his heart. But I've stopped waiting for that call. I've stopped living in the shadow of what might have been. My life is not defined by who abandoned me, but by how I chose to rise in the silence they left behind. As the snow fell gently outside and the clock struck midnight, I raised my glass in a quiet toast. Not to wealth, not to reconciliation, but to peace. Because in the end, peace was the richest gift life had given me. If you were in my shoes, if your own child ignored you for 20 years and only came back when money entered the picture, what would you do? Would you forgive them or walk away like I did? I really want to hear your thoughts. Write your answer in the comments below, and also let me know your city and country so I can personally thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss more true life stories like this one. Your support means the world to me.